In today's Farm Report, a change is coming to the meat sector, as Gary Crawford with the USDA reports.
In the U.S. meat industry this year, some forecasters say we could see something that hasn't happened since this song was a hit.
Shine, little glow, glimmer, glimmer.
If this forecast comes to fruition, it will be the first time since 1952 that pork production has exceeded beef production in the United States.
Quite a thing if it happens. Agriculture Department livestock analyst Shale Shagam says beef production this year is forecast to drop once again from a year ago.
We have been looking at declines in cattle inventories for quite some time, which has tightened up our supplies of beef.
So beef output may drop by a small amount this year, about 0.2%.
On the other hand, the pork production, we're looking at about a 6% increase in pork production in 2015.
Hog producers increased the breeding herd and the number of sows farrowed to make up for losses last year from the PED virus. Hog prices were up also, giving more encouragement to boost output. This year, there's been much less PED virus activity, so the average number of pigs per litter is going up, further adding to production. And to bring it all together, pork output could top beef production this year, but only by a paper-thin 30 million pound margin out of 24 billion pounds of production. But will that really happen? Shagam says it's going to be a very close call.
A lot of it is going to depend on what happens to weights of the animals.
Beef producers have had incentives to feed cattle longer and market heavier animals.
Conversely, on the hog side, as the number of hogs begin to increase, the amount of time they can spend in the finishing barns is going to return to more normal levels because you have that throughput. You always have to keep those animals moving. So we would actually anticipate that probably weights during 2015 are going to be coming down a little bit,
which could tip the scales back to beef. However, Shagam says right now,
we are still looking at pork production fractionally above beef production.
But even if that happens this year, Shagam says there's not likely to be any kind of a trend going on there.
Beef is in an expansionary mode right now. So we will expect to see beef production to continue to increase. Pork production, you're producing a lot of animals right now for slaughter. There is sufficient slaughter capacity, but if the increase in slaughter capacity doesn't keep up with the increase in the number of hogs, you'll see some downward pressure on prices. That may result in producers scaling back some of their production plans. So probably over the longer term, beef will increase relative to pork in terms of the relative levels.
And we might not see pork output topping beef production again for possibly, another 60 years or so. In Washington, Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Lawmakers are currently trying to craft a bill that would lift the restrictions on U.S. trade with Cuba. And at a Senate Agriculture Committee hearing Tuesday, a top Ag Department official said that to boost U.S. farm product sales in Cuba, we need
current restrictions lifted. We need to be able to use our marketing programs, and we need to be able to extend credit.
Undersecretary of Agriculture Michael Skews says if that gets done, then
we've got a great opportunity to increase our exports of corn. There's no reason why the European Union and Canada have the wheat market. That market should also be ours. I think there's a great opportunity for us to have the rice business in Cuba. There's a great opportunity for dairy and dairy products.
And not just for farm commodities, but also
agricultural inputs, fertilizers, seed, chemicals, and equipment.
Now, right now, the U.S. only sells about $300 million worth of ag products to Cuba, but when restrictions are finally lifted,
that number could be in excess of $1 billion.
In Washington, Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
The Food and Drug Administration will soon require restaurant chains to show calorie information on menu boards and menus, but will Americans use that information? Gary Crawford with the U.S. Department of Agriculture has more.
If your local chain restaurant or takeout place doesn't already have calorie information on the menus or menu boards, it will have by the end of the year. The Food and Drug Administration is requiring that. The idea, of course, is to give us the information so that maybe we might be able to make better or more healthy choices when we eat out.
The jury's still out on that.
In fact, Agriculture Department economist Hayden Stewart says the jury's still out on who is really going to pay any attention to the information, let alone use it or change anything. Hayden Stewart's one of two Ag Department analysts that we talked to who have studied this whole issue using data and consumer surveys from places in the country which already require calorie information on menus in restaurants, places like New York City, Philadelphia, Montgomery County, Maryland, just outside of Washington, D.C. What has happened in those places? Well, for that, we go to Agriculture Department economist Christian Gregory, and he told us about a consumer survey of about 5,000 people. And as far as those who use the information that many restaurants already provide,
about 8 or 9% of people say they use nutrition information at food away from home establishments.
But take that 8% with a grain of salt if your diet allows it. Gregory says 90% of those surveyed said they ate out in the last year. Now, half of those said they actually saw the information.
And then basically a fifth of those say that it actually helped inform their choices.
So a very small percentage of restaurant customers actually used the information that was there. And Christian Gregory says the people who say they're using the information may not really be the ones of us that probably ought to be using it.
It seems that people who already have good diets are using this information.
And Hayden Stewart says it is true for many, many restaurant consumers.
A lot of them go to the restaurant and are completely oblivious to that information.
Could be a couple of reasons for that. One, many of us already have a general idea of what meals have higher calorie counts than others just by some rules of thumb that we've picked up along the way. And most of us, he said, could do a pretty good job of ranking the main menu items as to calorie count. So we might not really pay that much attention to the calorie information being presented. And also,
People don't just go to a restaurant to find the healthiest meal. They want to eat something that tastes good, and they want value. So we don't expect that people are going to rush out and only buy the lowest calorie options. But people do make perhaps trade-offs among different foods.
and between different meals. He says to help us do that, the menu boards will also have a suggested daily calorie intake number on there, 2,000 calories a day. So folks might see that and know that the meal they just ordered has 1,000 calories already.
And that may help them to put what they're about to eat in the context of their overall daily energy requirements. And research has shown that may influence people to eat a little bit less later in the day.
But may not change our choices of food at that restaurant. And indeed, he says studies also have shown that in restaurants which already show calorie information, sales of low-calorie meals have not increased at all. We'll have more on this whole issue in a future report. In Washington, Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. When the U.S. does lift the many restrictions on trade with Cuba, the opportunities will be much greater for U.S. farm products in that market.
But we are going to face competition from those countries that are currently doing business there.
Brazil, Argentina, Canada, and the EU. Undersecretary of Agriculture Michael Skews telling the Senate Agriculture Committee Tuesday that, yes, we could go from $300 million in ag sales to Cuba a year currently to $1 billion, but it won't be a snap to do it.
Right now, the corn's coming from Brazil and Argentina. I think that we should be the number one supplier for corn. If you look at wheat's coming from the European Union and Canada. Again, there's no reason why that shouldn't come from the United States. 50% of the rice is coming from Vietnam. We should be the ones supplying the rice to Cuba. There's opportunities for us to ship dairy and dairy products to Cuba.
But he says it will take a lot of trade promotion work in that country, which right now is banned by current law. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Washington.
The U.S. is currently working on two new trade negotiations, the TPP, or Trans-Pacific Partnership, and TTIP, which is a free trade agreement with the European Union. As Rod Bain with the U.S. Department of Agriculture reports, the new trade deals can boost exports, but also boost competition.
Trade is an important part of the U.S. agricultural economy, and the opening of new export markets for our ag goods is an important component of that. So what does the chief trade negotiator for USDA's Foreign Agricultural Service, Jason Halfmeyer, say are the fundamentals in looking for new markets?
We look at expanding populations, and we look at expanding income, and we look at improved competitiveness, or we look at infrastructural issues, or we look at alternatives.
Speaking at this year's USDA Agricultural Outlook Forum, Halfmeister says in the next 10 years, 53% of the world's population will join the middle class. Or put another way, by the year 2023, the global middle class is expected to exceed 1 billion households, with much of that growth coming from developing nations, many of which will be new markets for U.S. ag products.
These people are getting more and more dollars in their pockets, and one of the first things they do when they get that money is that they buy more food. Most of our consumers are overseas. 95% of the population lives outside of our border, so we have to access those markets if we want to grow or even sustain where we stand. And increasingly, that's where the purchasing power is too. Other countries are growing a lot faster than us.
Food demand worldwide, along with the growing number of bilateral and multilateral free trade deals, have led to significant export gains for the U.S. and on a global scale. And Halfmeister says trade policy is important in both expanding markets and in how the U.S. can compete in the global marketplace.
Lots of other countries are involved in trade negotiations, getting rid of barriers, which is having some effect on demand, but it's also having an effect on market share. Preferences are being decided among countries. So as we forecast how global agriculture trade is going to expand in the coming decade, there's a growth story there, but there's also a share story.
So with that in mind, Halfmeister says the U.S. cannot stand still when it comes to global trade and trade negotiations. unless it risks falling behind the competition in the world marketplace. And that is why current multilateral trade negotiations for Asia and Europe are important.
We look at TPP and TTIP, very attractive in and of themselves, but also as a road for us to address the rest of the countries to show that we're prepared to pick up the baton globally and really advance new market opportunities.
I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
With recent cases of avian influenza H5N2 in the states of Arkansas, Kansas, Minnesota, Missouri, and North and South Dakota, Dr. Catherine Wotecki, Undersecretary for USDA Research, Education, and Economics, visited a backyard poultry flock in Decatur, Georgia.
4 families in the neighborhood have built a chicken coop. They've got a small flock that they raise for eggs.
During their tour, Dr. Wotecki and a representative from the local Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service National Poultry Improvement Program discussed biosecurity.
How do you keep those backyard chickens healthy? And how do you protect them from introducing infectious diseases?
Actually, it's quite basic and simple.
Making sure you use a dedicated set of boots or disposable booties. Be sure to wash your hands before and afterwards.
And in addition to regular coop cleanings,
keep your backyard flock separated from wild birds
who may be carrying diseases. For USDA Radio, Susan Carter, Washington, D.C.